webinar is presented by Friends Health Connection. We're a nonprofit organization, and we try to provide webinars that show all different types of view and information and inspiration for people with health challenges. The information provided during the webinars reflects opinions of the speakers only and does not necessarily reflect the opinions of Friends Health Connection. The information is intended for your general knowledge only, and it's not a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment for specific medical conditions. Always consult with your own healthcare provider for information, diagnosis, or to treat a health problem, or for any questions or concerns you may have regarding your condition. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Jason Fung. Dr. Fung is recognized as one of the world's leading experts on fasting for weight loss and diabetes reversal, and his work has been featured in outlets such as The Atlantic, The New York Post, Forbes, The Daily Mail, and Fox News. He's the author of several books, including his most recent, The Diabetes Code, Preventing and Reversing Type 2 Diabetes Naturally. So welcome, Dr. Fung. And again, thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to get started by asking you a very basic question. What is diabetes?
Well, there's two types of diabetes, type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes is a disease often seen in children, although it can be seen in adults as well. And type 2 diabetes is sort of the opposite. It's people who are generally overweight and generally affects adults rather than children, although with the sort of obesity epidemic, we see it more and more in adolescents and children as well. But nevertheless, they're actually two different diseases, and diabetes itself is really a disease where the blood sugar is too high, and that's what causes a lot of the symptoms of the disease. And type 1 and type 2 are sort of opposite. Insulin, which is a hormone that brings the blood sugars down, is absent in type 1 diabetes due to destruction of the pancreas by autoimmune predominantly. And in type 2 diabetes, it's usually something called insulin resistant, which is that insulin is there, but it doesn't seem to be working properly, so blood sugars tend to run very high. And these are the what we're talking about mostly. So 90-ish% of diabetes overall is type 2 diabetes. And so that's really, and that's the one that's been really rising very quickly since the sort of 1990s.
And how do people know if they have diabetes?
Most often now it's picked up through screening blood tests. So again, I focus on type 2 diabetes because type 1 diabetes is typically in children and is a different disease than type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is the one that you see in adults and many people who are overweight. So when the blood sugar gets too high, you can notice that you're urinating a lot, that you're very thirsty, for example. That may be the only symptoms. And most of the time it's picked up on screening blood tests. So long before you get the symptoms, if you do yearly blood tests or every other year blood tests, people will notice it because your blood sugars are slowly rising over usually a period of 5 years or 10 years even. You can see this slow, gradual rise in the blood glucose. So it's usually picked up on blood tests rather than on symptoms.
What other problems can diabetes cause?
It's actually a very, very big problem. So it's the major contributor to a number of diseases, such as heart attacks, strokes, cancer. It's the leading cause of blindness, leading cause of amputations, leading cause of kidney failure, nerve damage. So it really causes problems with almost every system in the body. And given the fact that heart disease and cancer are the sort of leading causes of death, it's sort of considered the most important risk factor, sort of as important as, say, smoking, for example. Now, of course, we know that you shouldn't smoke, but a lot of people also understand that prevention is the sort of key to it, because if you don't, because you have a long time to try and treat this disease, so it develops over many, many years, you have an opportunity to prevent a lot of this damage. Like, it's the leading cause of blindness, right? But it takes sort of like 20 years from the onset to develop the blindness. Once you get the eye disease, you can't do anything about it. You really have to prevent the things from happening. Same with kidney disease and amputations and gangrene and all these osteomyelitis, and, erectile dysfunction. Almost anything you can think of, organ-wise, diabetes affects it.
Many people think that diabetes is a life sentence. Why do you believe the disease to be reversible? And I know you just said it could take a while for the symptoms, so that's your time to act, is what you're saying. So tell us about your approach to this and what you feel people could do to reverse diabetes.
So, yeah, this is what's very interesting is in type 2 diabetes, there's this feeling that is given by the diabetes associations and doctors and dietitians and so on, that type 2 diabetes is really a disease that progresses and is chronic. That is, once you've got it, you've sort of got it for life and too bad for you, but it's just going to get worse. It's actually not true at all. In fact, anybody, it's easily provable, because if you know somebody with type 2 diabetes and they lose 20, 30, 40 pounds, almost for sure that diabetes will go away. So on the one hand, what you have is a disease which is clearly reversible. And on the other hand, you have all the sort of authorities, the diabetes associations, and all this sort of thing telling people that it's progressive. And that's a huge disconnect, because the thing is that when doctors especially try to treat the diabetes, what they do is they give a lot of medications. But what they don't do is focus very heavily on the diet, because it's a dietary disease. And what they've done is they've treated this dietary disease with drugs. And as this disease continues to get worse, so, here's the problem. The problem is a poor diet. You give a lot of drugs. Well, you don't change the diet, but you give a lot of drugs. Well, what's going to happen? Well, the underlying disease is going to get worse. So you give more and more medications. Then the doctor says, well, I'm giving you so many medications and you're not getting better. There's only two possibilities. Either he's a bad doctor, or the underlying disease is just like that. So, of course, the doctors all say, well, the underlying disease is just like that. But it never was, because in almost all cases, and we've proven it many, many times, that if you lose weight, then the diabetes goes away. So therefore, that's where you have to focus your treatment efforts. And that's the sort of problem, is that we tell people that it's a chronic and progressive disease. We're essentially telling them to sort of give up. And that's what we did in our intensive dietary management program. So we focus sort of exclusively on using dietary measures to reverse type 2 diabetes, because it's something that causes a lot of disease down the line. So sort of like 5 or 10 years down the line, it causes all these bad diseases, blindness and all this sort of stuff. But if you're going to make a difference, you cannot simply take a bunch of drugs, because you can't drug yourself to better health. You're not going to get healthier by giving yourself a bunch of these drugs. You have to fix the underlying dietary problem, and so that's what we do. And we see people who reverse their diabetes, their type 2 diabetes, sort of every single day we see this, getting off of medications, lowering the dose of medications, losing weight, and so on. And that's what's really important in this disease, not taking more medications.
Okay. This is somewhat of a personal question, but I told you, we did this brief run through, and I told you I have lupus and it's affected my kidney function.
Yeah.
So I'm on medicine for the transplant. I always feel like I wouldn't be here if they didn't have the medicine I take. But I also do everything in my power to stay healthy. So I try to eat right. I try to exercise, not as much as I should, but I do try to exercise. I try to do with what's in my power. What would you say to people who might feel that there's a balance here between, you know, losing weight and doing the things that you recommend, but still taking could the medicine still play a role then? Or do you advocate, do you believe it's best do you believe that if you control diet, you won't need the medicine? Is that what have you found best in this?
It totally depends on the situation. So if you have lupus, changing your diet is not going to do anything for you because lupus is not a dietary disease. So you have to look at what the underlying cause is. It's an inflammatory condition, and therefore you need to take anti-inflammatory medications such as prednisone and so on, which can cause diabetes. But that's a totally separate issue. So you have to see what the cause is. So if you have a
diabetes, for diabetes specific, you feel
for type 2 diabetes specifically, it's not completely, because there are certain drugs that cause it, such as prednisone. But for like 90% of the case, the cause of the type 2 diabetes is diet. So therefore, you have to treat the diet. If you take medications and you're not treating the cause, then you're not actually impacting the underlying course of the disease. And that's the real problem. That's not to say that you should never take medications. There's lots of times I use medications and I prescribe medications, but you still got to treat the underlying root cause of the problem.
And
so if you have, for example,
don't ignore those and do what you, do what you can within your ability, and diet is key, you feel with this?
Well, if the underlying cause of the disease is diet, then you got to treat the diet, right? And so it's like a car. So a car can not run for many, many reasons. If you're out of gas, then changing the battery doesn't make any difference. Mm-hmm. But if your battery is out, filling up on gas is not going to make any difference. So you got to figure out what the problem is before you can treat it. So if you have a disease which is, for example, not a dietary disease, then changing the diet makes no difference. If you have lupus kidney disease, if you have diseases such as IgA nephritis or other diseases of the kidney or any other disease which is not dietary in origin, then treating it with diet makes no difference. If you have a dietary disease, then you've got to treat the diet. And that's basically what medicine is trying to find out what's causing the disease and fix it. Here we have what's causing the disease, which is dietary. We know this because, people always say that, it's a genetic problem. Well, the incidence of type 2 diabetes has skyrocketed since 1990. Our genetics have not changed in that period of time. In China, the incidence of type 2 diabetes has gone from sort of like 1% to like 11% since 1980. So in a generation, it's gone up like tenfold. That's not a genetic problem. So everybody wants to blame, it's a genetic problem as you get older. It's not a genetic problem as you get older because the disease has gone up so much within a generation is clearly a dietary problem. So you have to sort of see where the problem is and try and fix it. You can't just sort of just keep throwing medications at it, because if medication is not your problem, if it's a dietary problem and you give drugs, have you changed the diet? If the answer is no, then you really haven't done anything for this condition. It's kind of like if you have a big cut and it's bleeding out and you say, your blood count's low, I'm going to transfuse you. Well, that's not really very useful, because the reason that your blood is low is because you're bleeding. So you got to stop the bleeding. And this is the whole problem with diabetes medicine, type 2 diabetes medicine specifically, is that we simply ignore the real cause of the disease and then just try and fix the disease around the edges. And when we see the disease getting worse, we say, well, that's just the way it is. And it's like, well, that's not the way it is. So again, we treat people with diet for type 2 diabetes, and I would estimate that 90% of type 2 diabetes is related to dietary problems.
So let me ask you, and we have a few questions coming in, which I'll get to, but let me just ask you, could you talk about the dietary approach and fasting, how it works and why you recommend it?
Well, to understand the disease of type 2 diabetes, really the only thing you need to know is that there's too much sugar in your body, not necessarily just the blood, but in your whole body. So if you take drugs, the question is, do those drugs help get rid of all that sugar in your body? And if the answer is no, then you know those drugs aren't going to do you any good. So if there's too much sugar in your body, there's only two things you need to do. You need to, one, stop putting sugar in your body, and two, let your body burn it off. And that's why we do intermittent fasting, because you're not putting sugar in your body. At the same time, you're letting your body naturally burn off the sugar that's still in there. As you do it consistently, then your sugars go down. And nobody doubts that. If you don't eat, your blood sugars will fall. If you continue to not eat, you'll lose weight. As you lose weight, your type 2 diabetes gets better. And hey, there, you fixed the problem. So why do you need medications? You've just fixed it naturally, using literally the oldest dietary intervention known to mankind, which is fasting, which has been used for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And yet we sort of ignore that whole dietary side. And what we do when we see people as physicians is that we start piling on the medications with barely a thought about how to change their diet to take care of it.
How does fasting affect our food cravings? And how does it affect our food cravings?
If you look at the studies of food cravings, what you find is that if you cut the intake of those cravings down very, very close to zero, then the cravings basically go away. So everybody knows about if you have an itch, you shouldn't scratch it, because you scratch it, it's going to make it worse. And cravings are not much different. So if you have, say, sugar cravings and you eat a little bit of sugar, that's not going to make it better. That's going to make it worse. If you cut your sugar intake, and it happens for junk food and salty foods and so on, and they've done studies on this, if you are craving those foods and you cut those foods down very close to zero, then over a period of weeks, because it's not something that happens sort of the next day, over a period of weeks, those cravings actually go away. So because fasting, you're not eating anything, you're actually going to be able to help with those food cravings, whether it's carbohydrates or whether it's sweets or whether it's chocolate or whatever it is. If you eat almost none of it, it will likely get better.
So the hard part is getting to that point, I would think. When you first start, I would think, is that the hardest part, because that's when you have the cravings.
Yeah, there's about a 2-week, 3-week period of when you start the intermittent fasting that is tough, because you're not used to it. And you have to get through that. And it's like anything else. If you do any, say, running, if the first time you run, you might be really, really sore and think, oh, this is such a bad idea. But you have to stick with it and let your body get used to it. So fasting is not much different. The first couple of weeks kind of sucks, and then you get used to it. You get used to dealing with the hunger, dealing with the other thing. It's not fun. Like, don't get me wrong. It's not something that anybody loves doing. Some people do, but they're very, very rare. But it's something that's healthy for you, and that's the difference. You have to treat it like it's a medicine, right? It's something you don't want to do, but you should do it because it's for your health. And I'd rather eat donuts myself, but the thing is that if you do that all the time, you're going to get sick. Now, if you have type 2 diabetes, then the fasting is something that will help you, but it's not easy, and that's where we in our IDM program, we try and put in the supports for people to understand. So we have a program, we have people actually from all over the world where we do this dietary intervention, where we help them with the fasting, because everything's hard if you don't know what you're doing. So we provide guidance to help you. We put you in small groups where other people will be able to support you, get peer support and all that stuff. So we put in the supports that are necessary to help with the fasting, because it's hard work, and everybody does better when you're doing it with people who you can listen to or trust. And that's why we have it, this whole program developed for that reason specifically, because we know that if I just told somebody to do it, and I did this sort of 5 years ago, I just say, oh, this is what you need to do. They'd do it for a few weeks and then they'd be off of it. And that's no different if you're doing running or cycling or whatever. It's easier if you join a club, or if you do it in a group, or you have a friend who does it, or whatever. It's no different than any of that. Or groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, where people will help each other by trying to get sober all at the same time, because it's easier to do. And the fasting's much the same. And everybody thinks, well, you'll never do it. It's like, well, it's up to you if you want to do it or not. It's not fun. But neither is going on dialysis, and neither is going blind, and neither is having a heart attack. But if those things happen, then you can't do anything about it. The damage will have been done already. You can only try to prevent those things from happening. And you know, if you get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, that your risk is extremely high that you will go on to have a heart attack, for example.
Where is your clinic, and how does someone get in touch with it to access it?
Our clinic is online, so it's idmprogram.com, which stands for Intensive Dietary Management, and anybody can join. We basically provide dietary counseling, so they would have to have their own physician who monitors their medications and so on, and we would help them with the fasting. We suggest sort of fasting regimens with them, and we have people from all over the world, so anybody can join from basically all over the world. We have people sort of from New Zealand to South Africa to, Canada, United States, UK, sort of everywhere. So as long as you can get online, you can join the program. And, we have people sort of specially trained to help others with the fasting part of it. Because again, it's just like, sort of 100 years ago when fasting is sort of routine, you knew a lot of people who could help you with the fasting. Now nobody does it, so nobody knows what are the problems that come up. Like, what about magnesium supplementation and salt, and what do I do about the hunger, and how about the headaches and this? There are little things that come up because it is an intensive dietary strategy, but they're all things that you can get over with a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of help, and sort of support. Anybody can do it.
I wanted to hold up your book so everyone could see it, The Diabetes Code, which is available on Amazon and most places where books are sold. And I have one last question, and then I'm gonna address some of the questions that other people are typing in here. But my last question is, how does this relate to the keto diet? Is that basically in line with what you're recommending?
Yeah, so the keto diet is a very low carbohydrate diet, and essentially it has the same goal, which is sort of, if you're eating a diet very low in carbohydrates, then carbohydrates are basically chains of sugar. So you're basically not putting sugar into your body, which is going to be helpful if your disease is that you have too much sugar in your body. So it's the same thing. It has the same goals, but obviously fasting is nothing at all. So it's more powerful than a ketogenic diet, although you can do very well with a ketogenic diet.
Okay, great. So I'm going to turn it over. And the reason I ask is I've been reading about that diet, and I know there's a lot of resources for it online and books about it now. So okay, so Christopher is on, and he asked an interesting question. He says, I am Asian and have older family who is old school and who are type 2 diabetic. I know your methods work and the success is real. How do you change the older generation mindset to change their diet and follow the protocol?
Essentially, it's difficult because there's a lot of people telling you sort of the opposite thing, which is that you should eat like 6 times a day. So it is difficult, I'll have to say, but essentially, if you can sort of talk to them and let them try it, then they'll see for themselves whether it works or not. So you just have to say, well, think about it for a second. If your blood sugar is high, or if your sugar is high, then let your body use it up, because that's why you have all that sugar. It's energy. So don't put more sugar in your body. Let your body burn it up. You're doing the wrong thing. And really the idea is to let them try it for a little bit. And if they can buy in, then they'll see the results for themselves, because it's hard to convince people otherwise when everybody is telling you something different. But if you look at the success rate of what's, the treatments for diabetes and so on, they've been abysmal. They've been terrible.
This is another question Karen asks, or says. She says, loved the diabetes code. I'm a type 2 diabetic, lost 50 pounds, went off 4 diabetic medications, 2 blood pressure meds, Pantaloc for GERD. It is a maintenance of low carb, high fat that I struggle with. Is it possible to introduce high carb and cut back on fat after about a year of maintenance?
Everybody's different. So in terms of the sort of low carbohydrate diets, it can be a challenge to sustain it, especially if you like it. So we emphasize more eating of whole foods. So even if you were to eat carbohydrate containing foods, make sure they're sort of unprocessed. So flour is a highly processed sort of carbohydrate. So they take the wheat and they take the protein out, they take the fat out, then they grind it into a fine powder. Then you get flour. And then everybody pretends it's such a natural product, but it's not. It's been highly processed. If you take something sort of relatively unprocessed, like beans, for example, then it's much different. So the effect on the body is completely different. So you don't necessarily have to eat a low carbohydrate diet, but the two things that are sort of important is one, eat real foods, sort of unprocessed foods, because there are a lot of people who ate high carbohydrate diets and did fine. So if you look at China, for example, in the 1980s, people were eating a lot of white rice. There was no diabetes anywhere, but they ate almost zero sugar. And that's one of the things. So the main thing is eat real food. So sugar and sort of processed grains are probably the worst offenders. And two, don't eat all the time. And this is the thing that's changed significantly in the last half a century, is that we've gone from eating 3 meals a day and no snacks to sort of 6, 7, 8 times a day. And we think that's healthy for us. It's not. When you eat, your body wants to store food energy, which is the sugar, which is the fat. When you don't eat, your body has to burn it. So if you're going to eat all the time, you're going to tell your body to always store food energy. So if you keep putting it in and never taking it out, guess what's going to happen? Well, it's going to overflow, and then you're going to get sugar in your blood, you're going to get diabetes. And that's exactly what happened. So let your body burn it off. You got to increase the amount of time that your body is sort of burning up the stores of food energy, which is the sugar and the fat. So those are the two main things. So yeah, you can absolutely do relatively like a higher carbohydrate diet, but stick to real foods and sort of don't eat all the time.
There's a question here too about the keto diet. And I would imagine that this might pertain to anyone. To anyone making a big change in their diet. The question is, what causes the keto flu the first week on the keto diet? And then if you could elaborate, when you first change your diet, are there symptoms, especially if you've been going from eating sugar and eating often and doing these things that you're recommending you don't do, to suddenly making this change in your life? Are there symptoms that happen when you first change your diet, and what could people expect?
The keto diet, so the keto flu is when you go to a very, very low carbohydrate diet and your muscles and everything is used to using a lot of sugar. It takes a couple of weeks for you to get used to burning fat, because if you're not eating any carbohydrates, you're not getting any sugar in your diet. Then your body relies on burning fat, and that's why you produce ketones, which is why they call it a ketogenic diet. So your muscles can use sugar or they can use fat. For most people who are eating a standard sort of American diet, they've been using sugar as their main energy source for sort of their whole life. So to go from sugar to fat, there's a couple of weeks where your muscles may need to adapt in order to. They have to sort of adapt their mechanism so that they're more efficient at burning fat as opposed to sugar. And that's why you can feel tired and all this sort of stuff. And that's called the keto flu. So it's just a drastic change in your fuel sources for your body to go from sugar to fat. And it takes 2 or 3 weeks to sort of fully adapt to that. And there's nothing you can do to speed it along. You can try and do it more gradually, sort of slowly cut down the carbohydrates and so on. And you see the same thing with fasting, and in that some people take a couple of weeks to really feel like they can function normally while fasting. So it's the same thing. It's your body sort of adapting to it.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's a lot of questions, but I'm going to pick 2 last ones. Someone named Riza asked, would you comment on type 2 diabetes would you comment on the new research from Sao Paulo in Brazil saying intermittent fasting may increase the risk of diabetes and worsen insulin resistance? I know it's exactly the opposite. Just wanted to know your opinion on this.
Yeah, that study got a lot of press, but one, it wasn't published, and two, it was on a bunch of rats. The applicability to humans is sort of laughable. Honestly, it's kind of laughable that anybody took that study seriously. If you look at people who fast, so you can take Muslims, you can take, Christians during Lent, you can look at Mormons who do fasting, Buddhists, who do fasting, Hindus who do fasting, and there's no increased risk of diabetes with any of those groups due to the fasting. We've been doing fasting for like at least 2,000 years, right? It's mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned in the Quran, it's mentioned everywhere that people should do fasting. So we have extensive human experience with fasting. And we know that people who fast, so say if you look at cavemen and you look at aboriginals who, used to go days without eating because it was winter, or, the Kalahari Bush people or the native tribes of Africa, they would go days without eating when there was no food. And that's why you carry body fat. And there's no increased risk of diabetes with any of those groups. Otherwise, the Native American Indians should have rampant diabetes there. They didn't get it until they started eating all the sugar and white flour that the Western diet gave them. In fact, in the Inuit, for example, it was completely unheard of to have type 2 diabetes. And they would go through the winter in the Arctic Circle. So there was plenty of times that they weren't eating daily. So, it boggles my mind, truthfully, that anybody would, say, oh, here's a study of, 10 rats, and think that sort of is more important than the total, 2,000 years of human history that we have with fasting. So yeah, that whole thing was sort of, is just people wanted to find something new, so they did, but it strikes me as sort of ludicrous, the whole issue.
Okay, and I'm gonna just pick one last question. What is dawn phenomenon, and why does my glucose go up in the morning even when fasting?
So essentially, the way you have to think about it is that if your blood sugar is going up during fasting, like during the nighttime when you're not eating, where did that blood sugar come from? Well, it can only come from your own body. So essentially, your body is taking stored sugar, which is, you can store sugar in the liver, and putting it out in the blood. And this happens every morning. It actually happens to everybody, and that's why it's called the dawn phenomenon, because your hormones are getting ready for the day. So your body actually starts by pushing some sugar out into the blood. So you see this small rise in blood sugar in everybody, and it's a normal thing. In diabetics, type 2 diabetics, where you have too much sugar, it's a little bit over exuberant, so you see this big rise. So you can have an increase in the rise of your blood glucose even during fasting. You can not eat for a couple of days and find that your blood sugar is higher than where it was when it started. And the answer is that your body is using up its stores of sugar. And that's a good thing because it's stored away in the body, and that's what's causing all the damage of the type 2 diabetes in the first place. But that's essentially what the dawn phenomenon is.
Thank you. Okay, great. I want to thank you for being here, for taking the time. The book, again, is called The Diabetes Code. I know there's more questions. You can find a lot of the answers in Dr. Fung's book. And I want to thank you all for joining, for participating. If you want to stay on our email list, our website is friendshealthconnection.org, and you could sign up on our email list to hear about our future webinars. Dr. Fung, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time, and best of luck with your book.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.